the constraints of social distancing. You're listening to At the Alley on the Mental Health and Emotional Wellbeing Show on Ramadan Radio Wolverhampton, online on ramadanradiowolves.com. In the previous show, our guests Juni Mohammed and Layla Lawton provided some insight onto ongoing BLM, that's Black Lives Matter concerns, in addition to the impact of COVID-19 on Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, stressing an additional culturally sensitive focus on mental health and promoting access to mental health support. You can listen back to this on Ramadan Radio's YouTube channel, alongside finding further information, mental health information, on my Twitter feed at Atiya Ali 3. In the show today, we hope to provide information that may be helpful to support your well-being and the well-being of others, with a continued focus on mental health and emotional well-being. In particular, exploring access to mental health services for ethnic minority communities during these challenging times and beyond. Today we will be taking live calls within the show and welcome any questions or comments on 01902 972 150. You can also contact us via the WhatsApp messaging number on 07 440 420 432. You can message with your name or anonymously on that number, which is 07 440 420 432. And I will try my best to share your comments or questions. I'd like to welcome our guest, Monica, who is the Chief Executive of the Kaleidoscope Plus Group. Eid Mubarak and welcome to the Mental Health and Emotional Wellbeing Show, Monica. Oh, excuse me, sorry, I need to put your mic up. Right, we'll start again. Welcome to the show, Monica, sorry.
Assalamu alaikum and Eid Mubarak to everybody listening.
Oh, thank you, Eid Mubarak to you. In the show last week, we discussed Black Lives Matter concerns and the mental health impact on, in particular, people from the Afro-Caribbean communities. However, we also recognise that many other communities are affected. What are your thoughts about this?
The Black Lives Matter issue, I call it a movement because I don't think it should be a moment. I think it's something that's very high on the agenda and should remain high on the agenda. It's obviously focusing on Black people at the moment, as in the Afro-Caribbean community. It does also, however, affect Asian people as well. And I think putting everybody together in one category, as in the BMA community, it's not a good thing to do because we all have different experiences. As you know, as Asians, you know, there's the Pakistani community, there's the Indian community, there's the Bengali community, and so forth. And all of our experiences are very, very different. From my own understanding, you know, if you're Indian, you're more likely to be favoured over a Pakistani. If you're Pakistani, you're more likely to be favoured over Bengali. That's not right, but that is the way that the situation is at the moment. So when people think about Black Lives Matters, I think they do unfortunately misunderstand what it's all about. Some people think, well, why shouldn't it be about all lives matters? Black Lives Matter isn't saying that all lives don't matter. What it's actually saying is, at this moment in time, there is evidence that people from the Black Afro-Caribbean community are being disproportionately discriminated against compared to other people of colour. It's almost like saying, if someone turned around and said, we need more research in breast cancer, that's not saying you don't need research in other cancers. All cancers matter, but at that particular moment in time, for whatever reason, breast cancer is the one that's been highlighted. No one would have a problem with anyone saying research is required in breast cancer. It's a given that all cancers are important, and Black Lives Matter should be seen in the same way. All lives matter, but at this particular moment in time, it's the Black African-Caribbean community that are being discriminated against, and we all have a responsibility to ensure that we do what we can to ensure that that discrimination is removed and that stigma about those communities removed as well.
And what do you think the mental health implications of racism, let's name it, is? Do you think there's lots of mental health implications, and you've talked about how it's affecting ethnic minority communities wider?
I think there's lots of racism impacts people in a variety of ways. If we talk about mental health, firstly, I think there's a lack of understanding of what we mean by mental health. everybody has got mental health. Yet when you think about mental health, you tend to think about people with a mental health illness. Mental health, the concept itself, is not about illness. We all have physical health in the same way as we all have mental health. Sometimes our physical health is okay. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes our mental health is okay. Sometimes it isn't. So it's about keeping our emotional well-being as positive as possible. Now, if you're experiencing racism, obviously your emotional well-being is going to be affected. You're going to become depressed with the kind of challenges that you're facing. In maintaining a good emotional well-being state involves having some sort of purpose, having some sort of hope, having responsibilities, being accepted. Now, if you're experiencing racism, all of those things are affected, which are obviously then going to affect emotional well-being as well, which can lead on to mental health problems. So when we talk about mental health, we're talking about mental health generally, but when we talk about mental health problems, that's when the negative impacts start to surface, and that's when you start having diagnoses of depression, stress, anxiety, and other more sort of long-term conditions.
Yeah, so people will notice a change in their mood and anxiety. In the previous shows, we had a guest suggest that stigma is an excuse for services, and that actually Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities need to be actively engaged in therapy using dynamic ways. What are your thoughts about stigma of mental health and within minority ethnic communities?
It's an interesting concept that whoever your last guest was suggested that.
It wasn't the last guest, correct?
Okay,
Sorry to correct you. It was somebody in one of our shows, and our listeners can listen back on YouTube to hear.
I think it's a very interesting concept to think that, it's just kind of an excuse, because if we look at mental health generally, across the world, across the nation, across all communities, there's a stigma. Whether you're from a ethnic minority or not, there is a huge stigma against mental health. And there are people from the white community who will also not access services because of that stigma. So to suggest that it's an excuse for the ethnic minority community, I think is wrong to suggest.
Yeah, I think it was more talking about kind of, and I don't want to take the conversation, the previous conversation out of context, but I think it was suggesting that services might be using it as an excuse when actually there's lots that can be done. It's not just about stigma, but like you said, within communities there is stigma. So do go on. Yeah. Sorry.
So when it comes to services, again, all services, whether it's mental health or not, should be looking at the individual. It should be person-centred. It should be holistic. Now, if services are delivered in a way that prevents people from certain communities or certain sections of society from accessing those services, then obviously there is going to be an issue with access there, and there will be a stigma in terms of, well, that service isn't for me and therefore I'm not going to be able to access it. I think culturally as well, there are, within the Asian community in particular, there's a lack of understanding around what mental health is. We tend to want to keep our problems behind closed doors. We don't want to talk about it for fear of, what are the neighbours going to say? What are extended family members going to say? And those kind of things, along with how difficult some services can be to access, will prevent people from seeking help and also increase that stigma that's associated with it.
Right. And this, the stigma, where do you think it probably originates from? What is it about mental health that worries people in terms of accessing support?
From the people that I know who've experienced mental health conditions, they tend to feel as though they're not worth people's time, that they're hopeless, that they're a burden on people. And there's a certain, I guess, mask that people feel that they have to put on because they don't want to be seen as a failure. I know of people who won't, for example, talk to their employers about a mental health issue that they might have because they feel like their employers might turn around and say, well, actually, you're not capable of doing your job. So there's that fear of being rejected. There's that fear of feeling as though they're a failure, which prevents them, obviously, from then taking that step and coming forward to say that they need help because they feel like they're letting people down. But also I think as well there's a lack of understanding, as I mentioned before, particularly in the Asian community, around, well, is it possession? Is it something else? We tend to, through our cultural, religious and spiritual views, we tend to put a lot of our kind of problems and challenges rightly so to a certain extent, on those kind of issues. And we don't always look at the fact that actually it might be a combination of things. I'm not saying that they aren't things to consider. They are things to consider, but you shouldn't discount mental health simply because you have a certain belief system.
Absolutely. And sometimes the additional focus on things like possession prevents or delays accessing mental health services.
Yeah, that's correct, because people tend to focus on that more so than the medical side of things. Again, I'm not suggesting that people shouldn't believe that there is some sort of, religious reason for somebody's behaviour or somebody's illness, but equally you shouldn't ignore any medical signs that there may be as well. There's no harm in seeking support through both avenues. In fact, I think it's very important that you seek support through both avenues, because one of the things that people lack when they're experiencing a mental health condition is hope. Now, if your faith and your religion and your spiritual belief gives you that hope, then yes, definitely access whatever support you need through those areas, but don't ignore the medical side either. They can both work hand in hand.
Absolutely. And some communities might feel as though it's not something that touches us, mental health problems, it's something that touches others, perhaps. What is an individual's chance of experiencing a mental health problem throughout their lifetime?
So statistically, it's 1 in 4.
Right.
1 in 4 people experience a mental health condition in their life at any one time. But again, I'll go back to what I was saying previously, that we all have mental health. We all have physical health. Now, there's going to be days when your mental health isn't as good as it could be, and you may be feeling a little bit anxious about something, perhaps an event coming up, or there's something going on in your life that you're feeling anxious about, you're feeling stressed out about. Obviously, COVID-19's had an impact on people's mental health as well. We're seeing a lot more people as an organisation who haven't had a diagnosis of mental health condition, but they are seeking support because of the stresses and the anxieties that COVID-19 have led to them experiencing. So it actually can affect everybody in some way. I believe personally everybody will be impacted by mental health in their lifetime, at any time.
And when does it become a problem?
So again, research states that if you're feeling down, depressed, whichever word you want to use, if you're experiencing that for more than 2 weeks, if it's continued for 2 weeks, then it becomes depression. If it's less than a period of 2 weeks, then it's just the normal challenges of life that we all have. And if you exceed that 2-week period, you should actually be seeking some medical advice to provide that support that you might need.
Perfect. So you're talking there about low mood and depression, and how problems might persist, and when's the best time to kind of seek support. And the first port of call for some people are spiritual and religious kind of services. What would you say about that? What would you say to our spiritual and religious leaders?
I would say continue doing what you're doing in terms of providing that support, but also encourage anybody who may need mental health support to get the medical support as well. As I said earlier, both can work hand in hand and should work hand in hand. Medical professions shouldn't discount that people's religious, cultural and spiritual beliefs are very important to maintaining a good mental health and emotional well-being, and likewise spiritual leaders, religious leaders aren't medical practitioners, so they can't just say that it's down to this particular issue alone. There's no harm, as I said earlier, accessing support for both.
Yeah, and this encouragement from spiritual leaders and religious leaders to encourage individuals to access support when it's needed can affect positively the whole family. Can have an impact on the whole family.
Of course. If you are caring for somebody who has a mental health condition, actually the chances are that your mental health is also being impacted on, because it can be difficult, it can be challenging, it can be hard work. For example, if you are trying to care for someone who is at risk of suicide, you're always thinking, oh, is this person going to be safe? Should I allow this person to go out? Should I allow them some independence? If they're sitting in their room, what are they doing? If it's somebody who perhaps has a eating disorder, you also kind of think, well, is that person eating enough? what are they doing after they've you're constantly aware, you're constantly walking on eggshells, which isn't good for your own mental well-being as well. So of course it is very, very important that you look after yourself as well as those around you.
Absolutely, and the carer's role is quite significant in terms of looking after their own mental health and well-being. I'm sure there's lots of support available for carers specifically.
I wouldn't say there's a lot. There is some support. Unfortunately, carers do get overlooked because of the fact that the funding for mental health services is so restricted as it is. It tends to go into services where people have a diagnosis, which is kind of one of my bugbears. We should be investing that money and that funding into preventative services, because if you invest at that stage, the chance of recovery is a lot higher, but also the cost of dealing with somebody who's in a crisis is a lot higher as well. So it just doesn't make sense. And I don't feel that somebody should be at crisis point before they are eligible for a service.
Absolutely.
It should be something that we're looking at preventing. There's enough research out there. There's enough evidence out there that suggests that if you tackle anything early on, it's common sense, really, isn't it? If you tackle something early on, the chance of that getting exaggerated and becoming worse is a lot less than dealing with it when it's actually at that tipping point.
We will shortly be coming to a break, but I was just thinking that carers themselves might be putting themselves second, sometimes thinking that the person I'm looking after needs to come first, and probably not always taking their own well-being into consideration.
It's important to share that load, and it's important to recognise that you can't pour from an empty cup. So, unless you're looking after yourself, you're not able to look after the person that you're caring for to the best of your ability as well. And there's nothing wrong in saying, I need some help, I need some support. In fact, it's very important that you actually do that.
Great, thank you. It's been quite insightful what you've been sharing, and people can listen back to this on our YouTube link later. We are now coming into the break. You'll hear us on the other side shortly. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. You're listening to Atiya Ali on the Mental Health and Wellbeing Show, Emotional Wellbeing Show. And I have with me my guest, Monica Shafak from the Kaleidoscope Plus Group. Now, before the break, we were talking about spiritual and religious beliefs that might influence access to mental health services. So, from what you're saying, it sounds like there are thoughts around being possessed for some people who might want to seek spiritual support. However, for others, they might fear the cultural implications and stigma.
That's correct, yes.
How can services work around this?
I think whenever you deliver a service, you have to understand the individual concerned, and that service should be person-centred around the belief systems of that particular individual. Now, we all have different spiritual and different belief systems, and it's taking that into account when delivering a service to somebody. So it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, that, you know, if you are providing a service to somebody who may not individually themselves, but their family who are providing support to them as carers believe that there is a spiritual reason for perhaps the condition that they've got or whatever kind of actions they're displaying, then you have to respect that.
Mm-hmm.
You can't discount it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's to work with the family and work with the individual to complement whatever it is that they're already doing to support that particular need. So if they are going to spiritual leaders and religious leaders to help them with that particular issue, don't prevent them from doing that, because that is their belief system. That is what is giving them the hope. And as practitioners, it's important for us to increase that level of hope. So from a medical point of view, there may be medication that GPs can prescribe on top of the religious and spiritual support that the person's getting, but there also might be psychological therapies that other practitioners can also support, but it has to be a holistic service.
Mm-hmm.
You can't deal with these kind of issues in isolation.
Yeah, and it might be helpful for therapists to explore that with their clients in terms of the holistic approach, and we don't know until we ask.
Exactly, and I think if you're a good therapist, it will become natural to you to explore those issues. If you're not exploring those issues, then I would question how good that therapy is, because without exploring those kind of things, the therapy that's going to be provided to you isn't going to be effective.
Absolutely. So you've told us a little bit about how services can improve access or engagement with regards to taking spirituality into consideration. I'm wondering, with regards to this, whether it would also be helpful for you to talk about your other roles in equality and working for the FA. Is there some learning we can take from that? Firstly, tell us a little bit about your role.
It's not specifically with the FA. I do some work with the Premier League on their equality standard, and I also do some work as a non-executive director with Kidderminster Harriers and Birmingham Football Association. So basically, all of those entities have equality standards. So I know that we're talking about racism here on today's show, but equality is more than just racism. There are other sections of the communities that are being marginalised. There, for example, the LGBT community, refugees, asylum seekers. There's a range of individuals who aren't getting equitable services compared to mainstream society. So there are particular standards that all organisations should be meeting, and I think when we commission services around mental health, commissioners should make it a priority that whichever service provider is going to be commissioned to deliver that service has a minimum standard of quality that they are evidencing in their day-to-day delivery, because if they're not doing that, then obviously it's not going to be an equitable service and there are going to be issues around access. Again, I think that should be a standard thing that comes into play with all service delivery, not just necessarily mental health.
Mm-hmm. So do you support those authorities in that, in terms of your work?
Yes, so I in particular, for example, with the Premier League, if you become a Premier League football club, then there are 3 levels of equality standard that you have to meet, and obviously the lowest one is the minimum which each club has to abide by. So basically they're assessed They provide various levels of information, evidence to support whatever it is that the area of equality standard that we're looking at, and then they are interviewed. And as a result of that, it is quite a lengthy and in-depth process. As a result of that, they'll either be awarded the standard and say yes, you do meet it, or there will be certain areas where there's recommendations made. So, one of my roles is to make those recommendations, and I think that should become a standard thing across all services. If football can do it, and I'm not saying they're doing it brilliantly at the moment, there are a lot of things that need to improve, but at least it's on the agenda, and it needs to be on the agenda throughout other sectors as well.
So active steps to work with equality for all individuals.
At the end of the day, if you want to provide a service that works, then it needs to be equitable. It needs to be something that everybody can access and everybody will benefit from. If they're not benefiting from it, then you have a responsibility as a provider to understand why your service isn't being effective. At the end of the day, there's limited resources, there's limited funds. So if we're putting them into services that aren't working, then commissioners need to ask themselves questions as to why they're investing in something that doesn't work, particularly when mental health is such an important issue.
Absolutely, and the key word used there was equity. So coming back to people from minority ethnic communities who might be apprehensive when accessing mental health services, and some would probably prefer medication over psychological therapy, what would you say to them?
Again, it's about individual choice. As I said about a person-centred approach, you cannot take that choice away from people. My personal advice would be that in addition to medication, psychological therapies are very effective. Mm-hmm. You tend to come across people who actually don't want to take the medication as opposed to would prefer to take the medication, because again there's a lot of misunderstanding around whether that medication is going to be something that you end up becoming dependent on, what kind of side effects that medication can have. But what I would advocate is that if your GP has prescribed something, then you take your GP's advice. But in addition to that, also look at psychological therapies that complement that medication, because recovery rates are likely to be quicker. Mm-hmm. And also your dependency on particular triggers. You'll understand your triggers, for example. You'll understand what it is about your life, your situation that may increase the anxiety, and that's what psychological therapies help you to do. It also helps you to look at things in a different perspective. So one of the things that we say is that, if it's outside of your control, you can't control the weather, for example. You can't control what's happening in politics, for example. So
COVID-19.
Exactly. You can't control what's happening with COVID-19, yet that is likely to have a huge impact on your well-being. Focus on the things that you can control. Focus on your responses. How you respond is going to have a very a huge impact on what the outcome of that situation is going to be. If you respond to something in a positive way, if you respond to it, well, actually, there's no control I have over this, but what I can control is this situation instead, and put my focus on that, the chances are that the outcome is going to be a lot more positive than if you try to look at things that are outside of your control.
And due to mental health problems, if people are finding it difficult to always focus on the positive, or at times of severe distress focus on the positives, and it becomes a long-term issue, you're suggesting that psychological therapists can assist with that, right?
Definitely. So this CBT that helps you kind of change your way of thinking, I guess, is the best way of putting it.
Yeah, cognitive behaviour therapy. For those who don't know what CBT is, sorry. So, Monica, some people, they tend to wait until they have to access mental health services due to the deterioration of their health, ending up sectioned. Can you tell us a little bit about what we mean by being sectioned?
It is very difficult, actually, to be sectioned. Being sectioned is an action that's taken as part of the Mental Health Act, where somebody who is either at risk to themselves or at risk to others, or is actually refusing treatment, can be, I don't like to use the word detained because it isn't actually detained, but they are taken into hospital and they are assessed for a particular diagnosis of mental health condition, and they can be kept in hospital for 28 days. They can be kept up to 6 months, depending on what the situation is. But you can also be sectioned in the community, which again I think some people don't fully understand. That being sectioned doesn't mean that you're going to be locked up in hospital. It means that there are going to be certain actions taken against you and with you that will still mean that you are allowed to stay at home or allowed to stay with family, friends, what have you, under certain conditions. In terms of not accessing services quickly, my suggestion and my advice would be that as soon as you are aware of a family member or a loved one who may need support, take action, because the longer that condition manifests, the harder it will become to actually recover from that condition. And obviously, again, with anything, if you nip it in the bud, it is easier to kind of deal with, and that support is made available to that person. You may find that if you prolong access to services, a condition that you could have recovered from actually becomes irrecoverable because it's gone too far. And again, it would be best if you try to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, so we are talking about a cultural shift here, aren't we? And you've talked a little bit about friends and family in terms of supporting people and recognising signs and symptoms. And perhaps if we begin to encourage friends and family to seek early intervention, that would be helpful, wouldn't it, in terms of preventing being sectioned or the severity of mental health illnesses?
Early prevention's key. The earlier we can seek interventions and implement interventions, the better all round. I mean, I think it's 84% of mental health conditions start before the age of 14. Not many people know that. Now, if we normalise mental health, we normalise words such as suicide, bring it into the education system so that when you are at school, you're talking about these issues, you're understanding what triggers there might be, you're understanding what stress, anxiety, depression, bipolar, and all the kind of other diagnoses that there are with mental health are, then the chances are you will seek help more readily and you'll seek it sooner. That's the stage that we should be aiming for. We should be bringing it into the curriculum. We should be educating children, and we should be normalising those words so that not only do people seek support sooner, but also we're reducing that stigma around mental health because it becomes a normal subject to talk about.
Absolutely, bringing it into our everyday vocabulary and language. In terms of mental health treatment, mental health problems, most people are aware that the NHS provide free mental health services, but some people are not aware of voluntary or private services or other services. Can you tell us a bit about the service that Kaleidoscope Plus Group provide?
So we're based in West Bromwich. We provide a range of services, really. We have a care home for people with long-term enduring mental health needs who are very unlikely to become better and very unlikely to be able to live independently in the community. We provide counselling services. We work with children and young people in schools. We have a floating support service which helps people who are either renting accommodation or have their own accommodation to maintain their tenancy, to maintain their home. So we provide mental health support that way. We have supported housing accommodation as well for semi-independent individuals. We provide a host of training around mental health awareness, around suicide prevention. We have a national emotional wellbeing telephone service that is free to use for anybody, and that was established just as lockdown kind of was implemented, because we were finding that more and more people were needing that kind of support, and that's available, as I say, nationally, and that's available from 9 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock in the evening, Monday to Friday.
And who is that for? Sorry,
it's for anybody. So if you are feeling a little bit anxious, maybe you need a little bit of advice about somebody who you're caring for, or somebody who's starting to display symptoms and you're not quite sure what to do, you can pick up the phone to us and get some advice on that. We also provide suicide bereavement support. Now, sadly...
with regards to suicide?
Yeah, with regards to suicide. So, sadly, people who are bereaved by suicide are also statistically more likely to make an attempt on their own life. Being bereaved is something that can lead to mental health conditions, but being bereaved by suicide is very, very different because of the questions that are left unanswered, the circumstances perhaps that the person may have taken their life in, the guilt that people who are left behind tend to feel. So there are specific support services that we provide for them as well. And we also provide a suicide prevention text line, which is available again free of charge 24/7, which is national service as well, which anyone can contact us on at any time if they're feeling that they're in a crisis. So there's a range of things really that we can provide.
Perhaps you could provide us with those numbers a little later on.
Yes, definitely.
In terms of other services that you provide, did you say there was therapeutic services that you also provide, or have you not come on to that yet?
Yes, so we do provide counselling services, and again, that's available to anybody. It isn't a free service, unlike some voluntary sector organisations, well, not voluntary sector organisations, sorry, the NHS. But what you find with NHS services, and not just with psychological support, but generally with NHS services, is a huge waiting list. Now, the last thing you want to say to somebody who comes forward to seek support is, oh yeah, I understand that you need help, but can you wait 6 months because there's a waiting list? That doesn't help anybody. If anything, it exacerbates the situation and makes that person feel like, they're not wanted. The worthlessness that they're already feeling is increased. So we wanted to come up with a system where anybody could access support at sort of affordable prices as well, because particularly in this time where people are being made redundant, financial issues are paramount. We don't want to sort of have a service that people, again, can't access. This is all about equality again. I know we're talking about equality in terms of culture, but there's equality in terms of financial equality as well. If people who are able to afford private services are the only ones that can gain access, what about those people who are on low incomes? And again, a lot of our communities tend to be in low-income families and communities. So our counselling services is an affordable service for all.
Right. And you're right, people on lower social economic status, they probably will not tend to go for private services, or did you say they were private, weren't they?
Yeah.
So in terms of those private services, and those that could afford to would put perhaps also their mental health first and be able to access those services. Is there any support available around that for your service in particular?
In what way? Sorry?
In terms of, you said people have to privately fund that. Is there any way that they could get funding for it, or any support from
So it's already heavily subsidised. So if I give you a comparison, so for example, to seek counselling from a private therapist, you're looking at a minimum of £60 an hour. Now, people tend to need at least 6 sessions before therapy starts to work. Our service is based on an individual's affordability. So if, for example, you are unemployed, or you have a income of, I think it's below £20,000, then our service costs you £15 an hour. But it then goes at the most that we charge is £40 an hour. Again, it's dependent on the individual, and this is what I was talking about earlier. You have to look at that individual. Mm-hmm. You have to see what is suitable for that individual. We are a charity, of course, but we're not a charity in the sense that we can provide everything for free. Absolutely. So those people who can afford it, we do expect them to be able to pay for it. But even when they're paying at the highest level, they're not paying as much as they would do if they were going to a private therapist. But all our therapists are accredited. They've gone through the same processes, the same education, the same certification as all private therapists. So again, there can be a perception that if you're paying less for something, then you're getting a lesser service. That isn't the case with counselling, because you have to be accredited to the British Psychological Council. Now, if we don't take practitioners on who don't have that accreditation, so the level of service that you get will actually be the same as if you went to a private therapist.
That's interesting, and it is quite heavily subsidised then, from what you're saying. Monica, in terms of individuals seeking early support, early interventions, what are your waiting times?
So at the moment, our waiting times are probably a week, because the way that we operate, the way that we're delivering services, a lot of our services are now online, which means that we can see a lot more people anyway, which reduces waiting times. But the way we match up therapists with clients is very different to what they would do in the NHS as well. We can seek support from a larger pool of people. So if we get to a point where actually our the therapists that are on our payroll are unable to cope, we have links with others that we can bring in to ensure that that waiting list remains at a minimal level.
Okay, so in terms of this quick access, what is your process to get into that point? I mean, in terms of assessment and understanding an individual's needs.
So basically what would happen is if you needed access to our counselling service, you can either call us on 0121 565 5605 or you send an email to counselling@kaleidoscopeplus.org.uk. You will get a telephone call or an email back within 24 hours. They will then arrange to do an assessment with you, which takes around about an hour. And following that assessment, you can either agree to take counselling up with us, or you might decide, well, actually, this isn't what I thought it was, or it isn't something that's suitable to my particular needs. Or it might be the therapist turns around and says, well, actually, this isn't the right service for you. Because, again, what we don't want to do is just put people on counselling who might not need it, because it clogs up the waiting list. But more importantly, it's not doing anything for the client, because if it's an intervention that's not suitable, then it's wasting that individual's time and exacerbating that situation as well. So after that assessment, again, it's just a matter of making an appointment, and usually within a week you can have your first session.
Okay, and do you offer services in different languages? Or?
We do. So we are very conscious that for counselling services to work, you have to connect with your counsellor. You could have an excellent counsellor, but if you don't connect with that individual on a personal level, obviously within certain parameters and certain boundaries, you are very unlikely to open up. And if you don't open up, you can't explore those issues that might be manifesting as well as you should be able to in that session. So we have counsellors from different backgrounds, from different genders, but also ways and means by which things can be translated if English is not the first language. And we do have counsellors who can speak other languages as well. But again, availability can be very difficult, because it doesn't tend to be a career that people from within our communities want to sort of take a career up in. So it can
Are you
be
encouraging people to do that then?
Definitely, most definitely. I think if you think about a level of service, a service, I guess, that will never go out of fashion, mental health is one of them. There is always going to be a demand for mental health services. We as human beings are always going to need support. Now, until the day the world does not exist, human beings are going to need mental health services. They're going to need mental health support. So it is a lifelong career. And there's so much personal satisfaction that you can get from this career as well. It's just a shame that it's not seen as one of those sectors to work in.
We've had a message in they haven't left their name, but they're saying, Salam, the show has been very informative and good awareness of the services offered by Kaleidoscope Plus Group. Good to know of shorter waiting times as well. So I think you struck a chord with some of our listeners in terms of
That's great to hear.
the waiting times. Now, you said you provide online services. There will be some people that can't access online support, and we're finding that within the NHS as well, in terms of access, where we were usually used to providing too many online face-to-face, let's say via video call services. What would you say about that in terms of those people who can't access the services, and have you found difficulties in that?
What we're actually finding the opposite. We're actually finding that more and more people want to access services online as opposed to face-to-face. If you think pre-COVID, one of the issues around accessing mental health services is that the condition that the individual is faced with leads them to believe that if you are talking to somebody about your particular issue, that the expression on that person's face, the tone of voice, for example, is judging them. So, and again, that would be a reason why some people might not come forward. Taking that face out of the situation is taking a barrier away. So if you think about it, a lot of communication nowadays is via text, it's via email. People don't want to talk in the same way as they used to. So we're actually finding that the services that we're providing online are getting more traction than the face-to-face service. But in terms of if you don't have that access, pick up the phone, speak to our Talk to Us service, and they will guide you through what you could do and the kind of support that's available out there. We've got a guide on our website. All our numbers are on our website as well. But as I say, I will leave the numbers at the end of the show. Take a note of them and give us a call, and we're there to help.
Absolutely. Let me rephrase the question a little bit. What of those people who can't access online services, and for multiple reasons? Sometimes it's a language barrier. Sometimes we were talking about a socioeconomic status in terms of income and affording Wi-Fi and access. What of those people?
What we would do with situations like that, where there's an affordability issue, is we would work with that individual to make sure that their benefits, for example, are maximised. Because if that's one of the things that is causing their mental health problem, then we have a responsibility as a service provider to support them in that. That's what makes us very different to some traditional mental health services. We're not one of those organisations that if you come to us with a mental health condition, we will only support that mental health condition, because we recognise that there are going to be a variety of issues that are triggers to that particular condition. So we try to look at the cause rather than just the effect. So if housing is an issue, if finance is an issue, if employment is an issue, if relationships are an issue, addictions, we are able to tap into various resources to support that individual in the best way that we can. My advice would be still come forward. We will work out a way of helping you.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of your services being commissioned, do you have commissioning from the NHS perhaps, or?
We have funding from a variety of sources, the NHS being one of them, local authorities being another. We have some funding from the Home Office. But to be honest with you, Atia, funding is very, very limited. And when you are funded from those sources, you tend to be funded for a particular service. So, for example, Sandwell Local Authority provide us funding to support people within Sandwell specifically. Right. Now, if you're in Wolverhampton, you wouldn't be able to access that service because you don't live in Sandwell. That's unfair. That's, we don't want to turn somebody away because they're living in the wrong area. So we are very reliant on donations. We're reliant on fundraising. So we have a range of events throughout the year as well that, we encourage people to take part in. Obviously, COVID-19 has kind of scuppered those plans because we aren't able to put those events on now. Absolutely. So we are, as I say, we are very reliant on fundraising and donations as well, as are lots of charities out there.
Mm-hmm. Monica, just to give you the heads up that we are coming towards the end of the show with a couple of minutes left. Where are your therapists based? Let's say those people who can't access online services. I mean, with regards to COVID, and there will be some social distancing in place, but at other times, where are your therapists based? Should people want to have the face-to-face therapy and those nuances that are in the room there?
Yeah, so our offices are actually based in West Bromwich, but the service is available across the Black Country. If you can't come to West Bromwich, we can come to you, because again, it's very important to us. Again, it's around accessibility. If people aren't able to come to you, then you have a responsibility to remove that barrier so that you can go to the people instead. So we do travel within Birmingham, we do travel within the Black Country, so that would cover Walsall, Wolverhampton, Dudley, Sandwell.
Perfect. Thank you, Monica. And if you've missed anything, people can surely get that on the website. Would you be able to give us the website address and the phone numbers again, just as we wrap up?
So our website is www.kaleidoscopeplus.org.uk, and our telephone number is 0121 565 5605.
Thank you, Monica Shafak, for taking your time away from your busy schedule and helping us understand the current issues that may be having an impact on access to mental health within minority ethnic communities, as well as providing insight to the services that Kaleidoscope Plus Group provides.
Thank you very much for inviting me on the show.
Now, as mentioned earlier on in the show, you can catch more mental health information by following me on Twitter at AtiaAli3. You can also listen back to this show and previous shows on Ramadan Radio's YouTube channel. We have had some messages coming through, and thank you for your messages. Another one I'll quickly shout out for you, Monica, is very supportive program. So thank you for coming in and giving us that information. Thank you for tuning in. You'll hear from me on the first Saturday of every month, the next show being on the 5th of September at 1 p.m. In the meantime, this lot will be, you can listen to the lovely Fawzia and Zainab with the Three C's show, focusing on careers, cuisine and culture. Thank you again for tuning in today, and do listen back to this and other clips on our YouTube channel. I hope you continue to have a joyous Eid.